As the web has evolved and social media and other networking sites have become more popular, claims-based authentication has started to become a more popular option, especially for larger and more popular websites. The idea behind claims-based authentication is that you actually get authenticated by a third party. So, for instance, Windows Live, you can if you have a Windows Live account, you can log into several different sites with your Windows Live ID. Or Google is another example. If you're logged into Google, you're logged into several other sites. Yahoo. You even see sites that allow you to integrate with your Twitter account or LinkedIn or Facebook. If you're logged into one of those, you can associate those accounts and already have your credentials all set up on another site. Well, MVC supports this as well, and it's ridiculously easy. I want to talk, though, about the different ways that claims-based authentication works. One of these, and probably the most popular one, is OAuth. OAuth is just a standard, a verification standard, and all the sites that support OAuth, you can use them in your MVC application because it has a lot of built-in OAuth clients, and you can write your own or just use a more generic OAuth client. People have made all kinds of projects out there on Codeplex to simplify OAuth integration and things like that if you don't have out of the box what you're looking for. So it's pretty easy. But the thing to keep in mind is that OAuth is basically an authentication standard. Various sites support it, and if someone is logged in on a site that supports OAuth, then your MVC application can also consume that verification ticket and get the credentials that way. Another authentication standard that we see is OpenID. You may have read about this. OpenID is very similar to OAuth in the sense that it also is a verification standard. And so you will have some sites that support OAuth, some sites that support OpenID, and sometimes both. Because nothing is ever easy, right? It would be way too easy if everyone supported the same standard. We have to have different ones because this is what keeps developers employed. So this is something to keep in mind. MVC can also support OpenID. But it's important to know that when you are trying to use claims-based authentication from one of these third parties, that you understand which standard they support. Finally, there's Windows Identity Foundation. This is a set of libraries that deals specifically with claims-based authentication. It allows you to essentially use any of the standards we've talked about so far, as well as some pretty high security standards supported by Windows themselves. So for example, if I log into a site that accepts my Live ID credentials, that's one thing, but I can also have sites that run me through Microsoft's verification process, for instance, to see if you are a Microsoft partner or a Microsoft employee, or in some other sense you have your credentials stored in a very Microsoft specific way. And I can actually use these different sites with Windows Identity Foundation to not only figure out who you are, but get claims back. And claims are basically information about you. So let's say, for example, I'm using Microsoft's corporate authentication site because I only want my site to be open to Microsoft employees. So what happens then is I set up my application to use Windows Identity Foundation, point it to Microsoft's corporate authentication site. People will log in at that site if they aren't authenticated, and then that site will send them back to me along with claims, their username, their email address, whatever it is that I've asked for. So that's another form of claims-based authentication. It's reasonably elaborate, but it's also very effective. And yet another way Windows Identity Foundation works is with deploying to Windows Azure. If your application is deployed to Windows Azure, you have an option that you don't normally have with regular web hosts, in that I can actually use my Azure account to configure third-party authentication. So when I fire up my Windows Azure account, I can actually say, accept Google authentication, accept Yahoo authentication, accept Windows Live authentication. I can set up custom authentication schemes or what have you. And then in my MVC application, all I have to do is say, hey, just use my Azure account, and then forget about it. And so anyone who comes to the website through my Azure account, the Azure account automatically checks for any of those third-party credentials. And so there are all kinds of ways to do authentication based on third parties. And so I want to be clear that there is no one way to do claims-based authentication. It really depends on who you want to integrate with and how complicated you want that to be. If all you need is a token that says yes, they're authenticated, and you can get on with your life, it's actually very easy. If you need to get back specific claims from that third party, like what their email address is or what roles they're in on that site or what have you, then it becomes a little bit more involved. But MVC does have out of the box some very easy to use providers to do our most common third-party authentications. So even if you never thought about using claims-based authentication or third-party authentication, you might consider it for your next MVC application. When we're considering using claims-based authentication, some people are intimidated by it because when you do research on claims-based authentication, there's a lot of articles out there, there's a lot written, and they are not always in agreement on what you should be doing, because that kind of integration is very specific to what you're integrating with, and it's specific to things like your .NET version. It's specific to where you're deployed, if you're deployed on Azure or not, and it can get truly complicated in certain instances with a lot of configuration and even a degree of trial and error, because even Microsoft's own documentation doesn't always agree on exactly how to integrate with an STS claims-based site. However, if you are just wanting to do something like OAuth authentication or OpenID authentication, if you just want to allow your users to log in from Windows Live or Google or Twitter, their Twitter account or their Facebook account or something like that, that is actually very easy. So what I want to do is walk you through the process of enabling these things, just so you can get an idea of how you might use it in your own application. First thing I want to do is point you toward a helpful resource. If you just make a new MVC project, and I use the Internet Application Template, then it will generate me a default MVC application, as you probably know. And when I do this, it sets me up an account controller that automatically takes care of a lot of login stuff using simple membership. Okay, so that's where the web security login methods are coming into play here. Okay, so that's all fine and good, but one of the things that I want to show you is by default, out of the gates, the login view actually gives you a little help if you want to integrate with third parties. I'll show you what I mean. When I fire this application up, and I go to log in, notice I've got my login form here. This is the account login view. But it also gives me this little panel over here to use another service to log in, and it says there are no external authentication services configured. See this article for details. So if I look at this article, just use that hyperlink, this takes me to a really handy blog post that tells me how to enable OAuth login using Facebook and Twitter. Okay. In both cases, I need an actual Facebook account or a Twitter account to set this up. And I do want to draw your attention to something. If you are running your site locally, generally your address is localhost something or another. And although the directions do tell you how to set that up, I don't recommend it, because everybody everywhere who is testing their website locally is using localhost and some port number. So what I highly recommend is that you test your third-party application on a testing server or something that has its own unique domain, something that isn't just localhost and a port number. But you know, in a pinch, you can probably get it to work without too much trouble. It just kind of depends. But I do want to point that out. But anyway, these instructions are very good. They show you how to get the key values that you need from these services to configure them. So for example, when I use Facebook, I'm going to get an app ID and an app secret value, and I need to know that. If I use Twitter, I get consumer key and consumer secret values. Then there's this little section on how to enable it in web forms, but what you want to do is come down here to how to enable OAuth support in MVC. Now I'm going to tell you that some of this is already outdated. This part isn't, but some parts of this blog already are, and we'll take a look at that in a minute. As you go down here, it shows you how to do it with OpenID services. So, you know, you have the OAuth protocol and you have the OpenID protocol for authentication. And if you want to use OpenID services, this gives you a rundown on how to do that, how to do it in MVC. This shows you how to use it for Google specifically. Okay, so this is a really good post and will really get you pointed in the right direction. Okay? And as you can see, it's not very long because, well, it just isn't very hard, at least for those kinds of basic things. One thing I do want to point out before we move on is if you are going to use the default views and things for logging in that MVC provides for you, I don't think very many people do that, but if you were going to use it right out of the box, then you might actually want to get into these views and actually change things. Like, for instance, here, this use another service to log in, this calls the external logins list. So here's the external logins list partial view. And as you can see, here's this paragraph. If you don't have any external authentication services configured, then here's the link. And you probably don't want to display that. So you either want to change this here or come to login and maybe do some magic here rather. You know, if you're not ever planning on configuring another service, you might just take this whole section out altogether. So it just kind of depends on what you want to do, but I want to draw your attention to that. But let's say we do want to configure an external service. Well, the good news is that 99.99999% of the things you will want to do, you only have to change one place. If I go here into app start, I have this C# file called authconfig, and if I open that up, check this out. They already have set up for me code to integrate with Live, Twitter, Facebook, and Google. Isn't that crazy? I mean, all I have to do is uncomment this code and then put in the keys that each of these have given me. Remember, I've got to get a key value pair, an ID and a secret from Live or from Twitter or from Facebook. I have to put those in there, and that's how these services know who I am and they know to expect my request. Okay? Google does not have those specific settings. Okay, so they're pretty open with a lot of their stuff, hence the OpenID. So let's say, for instance, especially since I haven't set up any particular IDs or passwords for these services, let's say I want to integrate with Google. Come over here. Okay, so I've got the application fired up. When I click login this time, now this panel changes to use another service to log in. So I can actually click Google. It takes me to Google. I sign in and it says localhost, which is my machine, would like to view my email address. Okay, now I'm not going to accept because I don't actually want localhost to view my email address. It's probably okay because if you notice when I look here at the developer info, it puts in a session ID and some things that are unique to this specific session. So I might be okay, but there's just something about telling Google, yeah, whenever localhost shows up, go ahead and give them my credentials. That seems a little weird. But if I hit accept, then what's going to happen is now my website will have permission to view you and you get logged in. So you're automatically authenticated and you're treated just like any other authenticated user. That was ridiculously easy, wasn't it? And that's all you have to do to register the Google client. Now, you may want to change these views around, but this is why I tell people, sometimes it's nice to go ahead and use the default template to get some of this default code. You may not use all of it, you might not even use most of it, but it is kind of nice to have some of these more obscure pieces written for you so that you don't have to mess with all of it yourself. So let's see how that works. I'll leave this uncommented for the time being. So when I come down here to the external logins list, now all of a sudden I do have account because Google is in there, and so it begins a form with external login, and it says login using another service, and it goes through the authentication client data and gives me a button for every provider that I have configured. This form goes to the external login method of the account controller. So when I click that Google button, let's see what happens. Come over here to the controller. Here's the account controller. Let's go to the external login method. Okay, it takes the provider and it takes the return URL. So it returns the new external login result with the provider, whatever the provider's name is, the action, and the return URL. Okay, now the action we've got is the external login callback. And here's where the magic happens. The authentication result comes back from verifying the authentication. Okay, and this uses the URL, the callback when we're successful. If the result is if the result is not successful, we send you to the external login failure view. If it is successful, if we've logged in through the provider, then we send you back to where you came from. Okay. We then come back down here, and if the user identity is authenticated, in other words, if you are already logged in, then we go ahead and create or update your account and then return you. Okay. Else you are brand new to this account, and then we go ahead and set you up. So there's a lot of code here that we can use for interacting with these providers. This adds you to the provider. This checks if you are authenticated. It goes ahead and automatically adds you to the provider. This is most of what you're going to need to do, though. This basically says I'm going to authenticate you against the URL that Google has given to me, and if the result is not successful, I'm going to send you the failure. If it is successful, then I'm going to send you back to where you came from. So this is a snippet of code you can just carry around with you, and it works for a lot of authentication scenarios. Now if I come back to this auth config, you'll notice that I have several different things that I can use. So let's say, for instance, I wanted to use Twitter. So this gives me that option, but I need to actually go and register my website with Twitter. When I do this, they will give me back a key and a secret value that belongs to me, and I can put these right here, and then it will work very similarly to the way Google login works. Without those values, I can only get so far. If you observe, you can see I already get an exception because an empty string is not allowed. And even if you try to fake it, you will only get so far. So let's say I say my key is A1. Whoops. Let's say my key is A123 and my secret is A123. Come over here to log in. I got my Twitter button. Now I get my exception because it doesn't understand, Twitter doesn't know who I am because I didn't have the key that it's looking for. But once you get those pieces of information, once again, it works the same way. And it's great because you're essentially offloading the authentication issue to some other application. You can still do your own internal authentication, but now you can very easily add the ability for people to log in at another website and use those account credentials in your own.